The first gunshot ripped through the chanting crowd, louder than the hateful slogans that had poisoned the air all afternoon. Screams followed. The marchers, dressed in black boots and armbands stamped with twisted symbols, surged forward like a tide of violence. Fists flew, bottles shattered, and in the chaos, blood painted the Miami pavement red. David Martinez had been clutching his younger sister Sophia's hand, trying to shield her as the hate group pushed deeper into their neighborhood. She was only 16, wide-eyed, terrified, clinging to him as the mob's roar grew closer. He kept telling her they would be fine, that the police lining the streets would keep order. But the officers only stood watching, arms crossed. As if this storm was none of their concern, a man broke from the marchers, swinging a metal pipe. David shoved Sophia behind him, but the strike came too fast, too brutal. The crack of bone echoed louder than the chants. She collapsed in his arms, her blood soaking through his shirt, her lips trembling as she tried to speak. "Don't leave me, Sophia, stay with me." His voice cracked into the chaos, swallowed by screams and jeers. The hate group marched on, chanting louder, their laughter rising over her last breath. And in that single moment, David's world was torn apart, his family shattered, his soul scorched by helpless rage. He knew then that this wasn't just a march, it was a declaration of war, and someone would have to answer for it. Just days before the march, Miami had felt like home in the truest sense of the word for David Martinez. Life wasn't perfect, his family wasn't wealthy, and bills always seemed to pile higher than his father's paycheck, but their little house on 8th Street pulsed with warmth. On humid evenings, neighbors sat out on porches sipping iced coffee, kids played basketball in cracked driveways, and laughter traveled across fences like music. For David, nothing mattered more than his younger sister, Sophia. At 16, she was still half girl, half woman, with a restless energy that lit up their small kitchen like a spark whenever she walked in. She was quick with jokes, quicker with hugs, and always eager to drag David out of his brooding thoughts. He worked long shifts at a garage downtown, coming home with oil-stained hands and sore muscles. But Sophia made sure he never stayed tired for long. "Sit, hermano, you look like you fought a car and lost," she'd tease, pushing a plate of Arroz con Pollo toward him, her dark eyes gleaming with mischief. Their mother would chuckle, shaking her head, while their father grumbled about keeping grades up and staying out of trouble. Still, dinners always ended the same, with everyone gathered at the tiny round table, voices overlapping, laughter bouncing off the peeling yellow walls. In those moments, the Martinez family felt unbreakable. Saturday afternoons were Sophia's favorite. She'd drag David to the local park, insisting they buy mango ice pops from the vendor by the fountain. They'd sit on the edge of the stone rim, sticky hands brushing as they argued over music. Sophia leaned toward pop, while David swore nothing beat old-school salsa. They'd laugh until the sun dipped behind palm trees and the air cooled with the ocean breeze. But beneath the surface, tension was creeping into their lives. Posters had begun appearing downtown, bold, red letters announcing the arrival of a nationalist group planning to take back the streets of Miami. Neighbors whispered in Spanish and Creole about what it might mean. Some shrugged it off, saying the police would never allow real violence. Others warned it was a spark waiting to set fire to the city. David tried not to think about it. He'd heard talk of hate groups before, but this was Miami's city, his family's city. He believed the march would be loud, maybe ugly, but nothing more. Sophia even joked about it over dinner. "Those fools don't scare me," she'd said, rolling her eyes. "They'll scream for an hour, wave their little flags, and go back to whatever hole they crawled out of." But their father didn't laugh. His fork clinked against his plate as he muttered. Words turned to fists. Fists turned to blood. Remember that. The words lingered, though no one wanted to admit it. That Sunday morning, the house brimmed with normalcy. Their mother hummed softly as she folded laundry, the smell of fried plantains drifting through the air. Sophia darted around the living room in her sneakers, pestering David to hurry up so they wouldn't miss their church youth group. He finally gave in, lacing up his shoes, and the two slipped out into the sunlight together. The streets felt calm that day, almost deceptively so. Neighbors waved, a child's laughter echoed from a nearby yard. The world was still intact, untouched by the ugliness that loomed just beyond the horizon. David and Sophia walked side by side, sharing a bag of chips, her chatter filling the air while he nodded, pretending to be annoyed but secretly savoring every word. He couldn't have known then that these simple, ordinary hours, the lazy walks, the shared food, the endless bickering about nothing would become sacred in memory, that within days, he would replay these small moments over and over, desperate to hold on to them, that he would wish, with every beat of his grieving heart, that he had stopped and told her just how much she meant to him, because soon, the laughter in that little yellow kitchen would fall silent, and all the warmth of Miami, all the ordinary beauty of their lives, would be swallowed by the march of hatred marching straight toward them. The first whispers of the march had seemed distant, almost unreal, like some ugly rumor that couldn't possibly take root in Miami. But by Friday evening, the city was bracing for it. Flyers were plastered on light poles and storefronts, online forums buzzed with threats, and local news anchors repeated warnings in tight, urgent tones. Authorities advise avoiding downtown. On Sunday, one reporter announced, her voice strained, as tensions are expected to rise. For David, the warnings felt exaggerated, the way adults sometimes blew things out of proportion. He couldn't imagine a group of strangers storming into their neighborhood to spread hate. Miami was too vibrant, too diverse, too alive for that kind of poison to take hold. But his father wasn't so easily convinced. They want blood, he muttered at dinner, stabbing at his food. And don't think for a second the police will stop them. David laughed it off, though unease stirred inside him. Sophia rolled her eyes, dismissing it as paranoia. But when Sunday arrived, the city awoke to a different kind of silencer, charged stillness that hummed beneath the surface. By mid-morning, people were gathering on sidewalks, drawn by equal parts curiosity and fear. Helicopters thudded overhead, the sound like war drums beating in the sky. David and Sophia joined the crowd against their mother's wishes. Pulled by the same restless curiosity that had gripped their neighbors, they told themselves they were only going to watch, to stand on the sidelines. But already, David felt a knot tightening in his chest. The first glimpse of the marchers hit like a punch. Rows of men in black boots, heads shaved, armbands marked with hateful symbols, moving in lockstep through the streets of Miami. Their chants echoed down the blocks, venomous slogans that made the air taste bitter. They carried flags, their colors bleeding against the blue sky, and their faces twisted with a fury that seemed almost inhuman. David felt Sophia's grip tighten on his arm. "This is insane," she whispered. Her voice trembled, but her chin lifted in defiance. Around them, the community pressed closer, anger and fear colliding in the crowd's energy. Some shouted back, waving homemade signs. Others pulled children behind them, ready to run if things turned ugly. The police stood between the two sides, not as protectors, but as statues lined up in riot gear, eyes hidden behind black visors, their silence louder than the marchers' chants. And then, the first bottle flew. It shattered near the boots of the marchers, spraying glass like sparks across the asphalt. The hate group roared in response, breaking formation, surging forward with fists raised. Chaos exploded in an instant. Screams pierced the air. People stumbled, pushed and pulled in a tide of bodies. The police didn't move. They stood watching as if this weren't their city, their people. David grabbed Sophia's hand, trying to pull her back. "Come on, we need to." He never finished. A man broke from the mob, face painted with a sneer, gripping a length of metal pipe. He swung it wildly into the crowd, a blur of violence cutting through the chaos. David shoved Sophia behind him, but the swing caught her as she moved, slamming into her side with a sound that would haunt him forever. Her screams sliced through him. She crumpled, clutching her ribs, her breath already coming in short, jagged gasps. Blood pooled beneath her fingers. "No, no, no, Sophia, stay with me." David dropped to his knees, trying to hold her, trying to block the world out. People trampled past, screams and chants filling the air. He shouted for help, his voice breaking, but the police line didn't budge. Not one officer came forward. Instead, he saw its smirk of one officer as his eyes met David's, a smirk, cold and knowing, as though this was exactly how things were meant to be. Sophia's lips trembled, her eyes wide with fear. "It hurts," she whispered, voice thin as smoke. David pressed his hand to the wound, his heart hammering. "You're gonna be okay, I promise. Just hold on, please. Hold on." But her body convulsed, her breaths growing weaker, fading with every desperate second. Around them, the mob marched on, their chants growing louder as though feeding off the blood spilled on the pavement, and then stillness. Her hand slipped from his grasp. Her chest stilled, her eyes fixed on nothing. David's world collapsed. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The sounds of the chaos around him blurred into a dull roar, like the ocean swallowing him whole. He pressed his forehead to hers, sobbing, rage and grief burning through his veins. The revelation hit with a clarity sharper than the pipe that had ended her life. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a protest gone wrong. It was sanctioned, allowed, protected. The police weren't there to shield the community. They were there to shield the march, to let hatred tear through the streets unchecked, and in that moment, David knew the truth. Justice would not come from the system. Not for Sophia, not for anyone. If justice was to be found, he would have to carve it out himself, no matter the cost. David stayed kneeling in the street long after Sophia's eyes had closed. His arms locked around her limp body as the chaos swirled. He didn't hear the marchers anymore, didn't hear the helicopters overhead. All he heard was the hollow silence where her laughter used to be. It was a neighbor who finally pulled him away, an older woman he vaguely recognized, trembling as she tugged at his shoulder. "Mijo, you can't stay here," she pleaded, voice tight with panic. "They'll hurt you too." But David couldn't move, couldn't think. His hands were red, slick with her blood. He stared at them, as if the stain itself were proof that he'd failed her, that he hadn't been strong enough, fast enough, to protect her when the medics arrived. Far too late. There was no urgency in their movements. They didn't run, they didn't fight through the crowd. They walked slowly, their eyes downcast, as though they already knew it didn't matter. The police still stood in formation, unmoved, silent, watching. At the hospital, the sterile smell and blinding white lights offered no comfort. A doctor he didn't know shook his head, muttered words like severe trauma and time of death, then disappeared behind a curtain. His parents arrived within the hour. His mother collapsed in his arms, sobbing uncontrollably, while his father stood rigid, jaw clenched, eyes glistening but refusing to break. David sat in that waiting room until the walls closed in on him. He watched families pass by, mothers clutching children, nurses laughing quietly as if the world wasn't ending. His world had ended, yet the earth kept spinning. When detectives finally questioned him, their tone was detached, professional, almost mechanical. "Did you see the assailant? Can you describe him?" one asked, scribbling in a notepad without meeting his eyes. "Yes," David growled, his throat raw. "I saw his face. I saw the police watching him." The detective's pen paused, then resumed. "We'll investigate, but right now, tensions are high. You understand?" David stared at him, his grief sparking into fury. "I watched my sister bleed out in the street while you all stood there. Don't tell me about tensions. Do your job." But he knew, even as he said it, that they wouldn't. He saw it in their eyes. The indifference, the quiet satisfaction. Justice wasn't coming. In the days that followed, David's world shrank to a suffocating silence. Their house, once alive with laughter and the smell of cooking, became a tomb. Sophia's bedroom door stayed shut, her sneakers abandoned by the front mat, her voice gone from the air. Their mother rarely left her bed. His father disappeared into long walks at night, coming home with his face set in stone. The community mourned candlelight vigils. Flowers left at the corner where she had fallen, but mourning turned quickly to resignation. "It's tragic," neighbors whispered, "but what can we do?" Others warned him to let it go, to keep his head down. Even friends distanced themselves. Messages grew shorter, visits fewer. It was as if his grief made them uncomfortable, a mirror of their own fear. He was left alone, pacing his room at night, fists clenched, replaying the moment over and over until he thought he might lose his mind. And with each replay, the same questions gnawed at him. Why didn't I pull her away faster? Why didn't I stand in front of her sooner? Why am I still here when she isn't? He screamed into his pillow until his voice cracked, punched walls until his knuckles split. Some nights he would sit in the dark, staring at Sophia's photo, whispering apologies she would never hear. The guilt burrowed deep, wrapping around his heart until it was hard to tell where grief ended and self-loathing began. But beneath the grief, something darker was growing at first. It came as fleeting thoughts, flashes of the man with the pipe. His sneer burned into David's memory. He saw him in dreams, standing over Sophia laughing. He woke, drenched in sweat, fists clenched, jaw aching from grinding his teeth. Then the thoughts lingered longer, sharper. What if he found that man? What if he made him feel what Sophia felt? What if justice could be carved with his own hands? Since the law refused to deliver it, the idea both terrified and exhilarated him. He would catch himself imagining it, then recoil, shaking his head. "That's not who I am. Sophia wouldn't want that." But the voice inside him whispered back, Sophia didn't want to die either. He tried to drown it out with routine, returning to work at the garage, fixing engines in silence, ignoring the pitying looks of co-workers. But grief followed him everywhere. Every tool he picked up felt like a weapon. Every customer's laugh sounded like mockery. Nights were the worst. He'd sit by the window, staring at the streetlights, hearing the echo of chants in his head. The system had made itself clear. Sophia's death wasn't an accident. It was permitted, encouraged, protected. And what happens when the system protects monsters? The question gnawed at him, relentless. He looked for answers in news reports, in conversations overheard at the bodega. He learned a hate group wasn't just a mob, they had donors, connections, and friends in uniform. Some of the very officers sworn to protect were the ones keeping them alive. The revelation deepened his despair. It wasn't just one man with a pipe. It was an entire machine, designed to crush people like Sophia and let men like him walk free. How could he fight that? Some nights he considered giving up entirely, ending the pain, joining Sophia wherever she had gone. But then he'd hear his mother's muffled sobs through the thin walls, see his father sitting alone on the porch with tears hidden behind clenched fists. And he knew he couldn't. He was all they had left. But being alive wasn't enough. Sophia's blood demanded more than survival. One night, unable to sleep, David pulled out the notebook where Sophia had scribbled her teenage dreams, college plans, songs she wanted to learn on guitar, places she wanted to travel. He flipped through the pages, his vision blurring with tears. On the last page, she had written one simple line, "Don't be afraid, hermano. We're stronger than they think." The words cut through him, sharp and electric. Stronger, not weaker, not broken. For the first time since her death, he felt something other than despair. It was rage, pure and consuming, but it was also purpose. He closed the notebook slowly, his hands trembling. Somewhere deep inside, a decision was taking shape, a dangerous, irreversible decision. If the system refused to give Sophia justice, then he would. The thought terrified him, but it also steadied him, like a compass finally pointing north. David sat in the darkness until dawn. His grief still raw, his guilt still heavy, but beneath it all, a fire had ignited. A fire that would not burn out until every last person responsible for Sophia's death paid in blood or in fear. The morning after David closed Sophia's notebook, the city was already shifting. News stations replayed shaky footage of the march-masked men with flags, fists raised, pipes in hand. Anchors used words like clashes, unrest, and mutual aggression, as though Sophia's murder had been nothing more than a scuffle between two sides. They never said her name, never showed her blood on the pavement. Instead, the cameras lingered on the hate group's leader, a tall man with a shaved head, pressed black shirt tucked into his jeans, speaking calmly at a press conference. "We are not criminals," he declared, his voice measured, almost fatherly. "We are patriots, protectors of our heritage. We came to march peacefully, and we were attacked by thugs who hate our way of life. If anyone should be blamed for violence, it's those who tried to silence us." Behind him stood rows of men, arms folded, eyes hard. They weren't snarling beasts in that moment. They were businessmen, teachers, fathers, ordinary men presenting themselves as defenders. Watching from the couch, David felt bile rise in his throat. Patriots, protectors. He had watched those same men cheer as Sophia bled out in his arms. He had heard their laughter, and yet, here they were, polished and articulate, painting themselves as victims. But what chilled him most wasn't their words. It was the way the reporters nodded, the way their pen scribbled dutifully, the way not one person challenged the lies. Later that week, David attended the community's town hall, hoping desperate to hear promises of justice. Instead, he found another performance. The police chief stood at the podium, uniform pressed, voice steady. "We regret the tragic loss of life," he said, as if Sophia were a number in a statistic rather than a daughter, a sister. "But I must emphasize that investigations take time. We are committed to fairness and transparency. Until then, we urge calm." From the back, someone shouted, "Where were your officers when they killed her?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The chief's jaw tightened. "Our officers maintained order under extremely volatile conditions. Without their restraint, this city would be in flames." Restraint. That was the word he chose. David nearly rose from his chair, fists clenched, but his father's hand on his shoulder kept him seated. Then came the district attorney, speaking in the smooth cadence of a man used to applause. "We cannot let emotions dictate justice. We must rely on evidence. The evidence, as it stands, shows no clear indication of intentional wrongdoing. No wrongdoing." David's ears rang. He could still hear Sophia scream, still see the smirk of the officer on the line. And yet here was the DA, dismissing it all with legal jargon. In the following days, names began to surface. The man with the pipe, Lucas Brandt, wasn't hiding. He lived across town, worked construction, drank at the same bars as city officials. He even gave an interview on local radio, voice dripping with false bravado. "Look, it was chaos," Lucas said. "People swinging, screaming. I didn't go there to hurt nobody. If someone got hit, that's on the crowd. not me. We were defending ourselves. These people hate us just for standing proud. Defending himself. David's stomach twisted. Lucas hadn't just killed Sophia, he had rewritten the story, turning her into an aggressor in his narrative. But Lucas wasn't the only face. There was Matthew Carver, a lean, sharp-eyed man who handled the group's social media and fundraising. His words were venom wrapped in silk, messages about heritage and family values that masked the rot beneath. Yet he had a wife, 2 kids, pictures of family barbecues on his profile. To his followers, he was a role model. And then there was Trevor Collins, younger, less polished, whose anger simmered closer to the surface. Unlike Lucas or Matthew, Trevor didn't hide behind rhetoric. He spat his hatred openly. But even he was given airtime on fringe podcasts, where hosts nodded along, validating his bile. Each man different, each with his own masks, but together, they formed something larger than themselves. A movement, a machine. What made it worse was the protection they enjoyed. The police chief had been photographed shaking hands with Lucas at a barbecue 2 summers ago. The district attorney's campaign had accepted donations, traced back to Matthew's cultural foundation. Judges dismissed cases against group members citing lack of evidence, and whenever protests erupted, the hate group was escorted safely home while counter-protesters were dragged into vans. The system wasn't just broken, it was complicit. David realized quickly that the imbalance of power was insurmountable. They had money, they had weapons, they had uniforms behind them. All he had was grief. But grief sharpened into obsession. He began collecting scraps of information, names, addresses, routines. He listened to Lucas's radio interviews on repeat, memorizing every word. He scrolled through Matthew's online posts until he could predict the cadence of his speeches. He watched Trevor's videos, noting the way his anger flared when he felt cornered. The more he studied them, the more he saw their cracks. Lucas drank too much, his bravado slipping into slurred rambling late at night. Matthew's perfect family man image was strained rumors of affairs, debts piling high. Trevor's rage often backfired, alienating even his allies. They weren't untouchable gods. They were men flawed, insecure, desperate to be seen as powerful. Their coldness wasn't born of strength, but of fear. Fear that without violence, without symbols and chants, they were nothing. Yet even with their flaws, they had something David didn't, a shield of legitimacy, handed to them by uniforms, gavels, and microphones. One night, David sat in his car outside Lucas's home, engine off, watching through the windshield as the man stumbled drunkenly up his porch. His hands trembled on the steering wheel. It would be so easy. One step, one weapon, and justice could be his. But he stayed frozen, guilt and rage battling inside him. Is this who I am now, a killer? Would Sophia even recognize me? He drove home shaking, ashamed of both his restraint and his desire. That inner war became his constant companion. During the day, grief hollowed him out. At night, rage filled the emptiness. Every thought of Sophia's laughter was followed by the image of her broken body. Every memory of her warmth twisted into the smirk of the officer who had done nothing. And slowly, the scales tipped. Justice through the system was a lie. Justice through restraint was impossible. The only path left was the one he feared most, the one where his hands would no longer tremble, where hesitation would no longer stop him. For if men like Lucas, Matthew, and Trevor could hide behind shields of law and community while spilling innocent blood, then maybe true justice required stepping into the shadows they thrived in. Maybe the only way to break the machine was to become something it could not control. David's nights blurred into one another, each darker than the last. He barely slept. When he did, the dreams came Sophia's voice fading into screams, her blood staining his hands again and again. He'd wake gasping, his chest heaving, drenched in sweat, and sit at the kitchen table until dawn, staring at the small notebook she had left behind. Her words, "We're stronger than they think," burned into him like a brand. For weeks, he had clung to the belief that someone else would make things right, that an investigation would be launched, that charges would come, that maybe, somehow, the system wasn't as corrupt as it appeared. But each press conference, each news article, each smug appearance of Lucas and his men proved otherwise. The world wasn't moving towards justice. It was moving on without it, without Sophia. And that was the moment David stopped waiting. The decision didn't come all at once, but in pieces, like bricks falling into place. The first came when he found himself parked outside Lucas Brandt's construction site, watching the man laugh with his co-workers. He sat there for hours, his hands tightening and loosening on the steering wheel, a war raging inside him. Every part of him screamed to get out, to walk across the lot and make Lucas feel what Sophia had felt, but he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he pulled out a notebook of his own and began to write names, addresses, schedules. The second piece came when he realized how easy it was to find them. Matthew Carver's social media was practically a roadmap: his kids' school recitals, his wife's charity events, his favorite restaurants. Trevor Collins wasn't discreet either. His anger spilled online, boasting about fights, tagging bars he frequented. Lucas was the simplest of all: loud, careless, a man who believed his connections made him untouchable. David wrote it all down. Pages and pages of patterns, movements, vulnerabilities. It became an obsession. He spent nights following their cars at a distance, days combing through their online presence, every detail a thread in the web he was weaving. Yet with each note, each piece of information, came hesitation. He would sit in his room, staring at the lists, and hear his sister's voice. Would she want this? Would she want me to become like them? He'd imagined her face warm, full of life, and then see her broken body on the asphalt. The images collided until he couldn't tell one from the other. If I do nothing, her death means nothing, he told himself. If I act, at least it means something. But another voice whispered, and if you act, what does that make you? He didn't have an answer, not one that let him sleep at night. The symbolic moment came quietly, almost antic. One evening, after hours of pacing, David walked into his father's shed. The smell of oil and wood hung in the air. Tools lined the walls, old but well kept. His father's hammer rested on the bench. David's hand hovered over it, trembling, before finally closing around the handle. The weight was solid, heavy, final. He carried it back to his room, hiding it beneath his bed. That it wasn't a plan yet. It wasn't even a clear step, but it was a line crossed, the first acceptance that violence might be the only answer left. From that night forward, something in him shifted. He stopped thinking like a grieving brother and started thinking like a hunter. David began to test the edges of his resolve. He followed Lucas one night, watching as the man staggered from a bar to his car, fumbling with his keys. David stood across the street, the hammer in his backpack, his heart thundering so loud he was sure it would give him away. 1 step, 2 steps. The distance closed out, and then Lucas turned, laughing with a friend, oblivious. The sight froze David in place. For all his hatred, for all his rage, David couldn't move. His body betrayed him. His legs trembled, his breath caught, and he stumbled backward into the shadows. Shame consumed him. He drove home with shaking hands, the hammer untouched, and sat in the driveway until morning. But the failure didn't stop him, it hardened him. The next day he returned to the notebook, rewriting his plans, refining his strategy. If he couldn't strike blindly, he would strike with purpose. He studied them not just as enemies, but as men. Lucas, brash and arrogant, sought respect he'd never earned. Matthew craved control, a veneer of sophistication masking debts and insecurities. Trevor, the youngest, was desperate for belonging, his rage a mask for fear. They weren't gods. They weren't untouchable. They were human, and humans could bleed. David began running again, pushing his body until his lungs burned, until sweat poured down his back. He lifted weights in the garage at night, fists clenched around rusted iron. Every repetition, every drop of sweat, was fuel. He was forging himself into something sharper, something capable. He also began gathering tools beyond the rope, gloves, a hunting knife tucked into the lining of an old backpack. Items, he told himself, were for self-defense, though he knew better. Each object was a promise, silent but unbreakable still. The guilt gnawed at him. One night his mother found him sitting in the dark kitchen, staring at the hammer on the table. She touched his arm gently, her face etched with grief. "David," she whispered, her voice trembling, "don't lose yourself, please. I've already lost her. I can't lose you too." Her words cut deeper than any weapon. He wanted to tell her he was fine, that he wasn't thinking what she feared. But he couldn't, because deep down he knew she was right. He was already slipping when she left, tears in her eyes. David stared at the hammer a long time before sliding it back into his bag. His chest ached with the weight of betrayal of her, of Sophia, of himself. But the fire inside him didn't dim, it only burned hotter. The final push came when he saw Lucas again on television, laughing, waving at reporters as if nothing had happened. The anchor called him a controversial figure, not a killer. The segment ended with the words, "No charges filed." That night, David returned to Sophia's notebook. He flipped to the page where she had written her dreams, her future. His thumb pressed against her handwriting, the ink slightly smudged from old erasures. "I'm sorry, Sophie," he whispered, his voice breaking, "but I can't let them walk away. I won't. His decision crystallized. There would be no more hesitation, no more waiting. The system had made its choice. Now he would make his. David's first true step toward action came 2 nights later. He followed Trevor Collins from a rally, staying 2 cars back as the young man's truck swerved recklessly through traffic. Trevor finally pulled into a dingy bar on the outskirts of town. David parked across the street, watching. Hours passed. Midnight came. Then 1 o'clock. Finally, Trevor stumbled out, drunk and alone, fumbling with his phone. David's hand tightened on the steering wheel. This was it. The moment of no return. He opened his bag, his fingers brushing the hammer's cold steel. His pulse thundered in his ears. He stepped out of the car. For the first time, he didn't tremble, didn't hesitate. The night air was heavy, the street silent but for Trevor's drunken muttering. David took 1 step forward, then another, his shadow stretching long across the pavement. There was no turning back now. David's footsteps echoed in the silence of that empty street as he approached Trevor Collins, the hammer cold and heavy in his hand. For a moment, everything else fell away. The grief, the hesitation, the doubts. It was just him and Trevor, predator and prey. But before he could close the gap, headlights swept across the parking lot. A squad car pulled up, its siren briefly chirping. 2 officers stepped out, hands resting on their belts. David G. Martinez, one called, his voice flat, knowing. Step away from the vehicle. David froze, his stomach dropping. They knew his name. Trevor squinted, blinking drunkenly, then smirked when he recognized him. That the brother, he slurred. The crybaby. He laughed, stumbling into his truck, starting the engine as the officers watched. Hand did nothing. As Trevor's taillights disappeared into the night, one officer approached David, his smile sharp as a blade. Bad night to take a walk, son. Go home before you find yourself in a cell. David said nothing, his chest heaving, the hammer hidden in his jacket. He turned and walked back to his car, fury burning so hot it felt like it would rip him apart. The message was clear. They were watching him, protecting the very men who had murdered his sister. The next morning, David's father confronted him. The police came to the house, he said, voice heavy with exhaustion. They warned us, said you're being reckless, that you're under suspicion. David's jaw clenched. Suspicion? For what? Breathing? For existing while they let killers walk free. His father slammed his fist on the table. You think I don't want justice? You think I don't wake up every night hearing her scream? But this path you're on, his voice cracked, grief tearing through his composure. You'll end up dead. And then what will we have left? David looked at him, seeing not anger but fear. Fear of losing his only son. Fear of being powerless again. But David couldn't turn back. Not now. The resistance grew heavier with every step he took. At the garage where he worked, his boss pulled him aside. Look man, he said quietly, the cops came asking about you. Said you've been hanging around the wrong places. I can't have that kind of heat here. David stared at him, betrayal stinging. So you're firing me? The man sighed, avoiding his eyes. I'm sorry, David. I got a family. I can't risk it. The garage, his one source of stability, was gone. Even friends drifted further. Calls went unanswered, texts ignored. Some said outright, don't drag me into this, bro. I can't fight the system. Others simply vanished, unwilling to stand beside him as he pushed against the tide. Isolation wrapped tighter around him until it felt suffocating. But the worst came from within his own home. One night, his mother found the notebook under his bed, the pages filled with names, routines, addresses. Her hands trembled as she held it. David, what is this? She whispered, tears brimming. He froze, caught between denial and truth. Finally, he said, voice low, it's justice, Mama, the justice they'll never give us. Her face crumpled. This isn't justice. This is death. First Sophia, now you. I can't. Her words broke into sobs, her body shaking. You think she'd want this? You think she'd want to watch her brother drown in blood? Her pain was a knife in his chest, twisting deep. For a moment, he almost tore the notebook apart, almost threw the hammer into the bay. But then he remembered Trevor's smirk, Lucas's interviews, Matthew's polished lies and the image of the officer smirking as Sophia died. He gently took the notebook back, his voice steady but cold. I don't have a choice. Her tears fell silently. A mother watching her son slip into the same grave her daughter had been shoved into. The system tightened its grip when David tried to file another report, demanding charges. The clerk at the station barely looked at him. Case is closed, she said flatly. Closed. David's voice cracked with fury. My sister was murdered in front of hundreds of witnesses. The clerk shrugged. Unconfirmed. Lack of evidence. You can appeal to the DA if you want, but she trailed off, her smirk saying the rest. Outside, David slammed his fists against the hood of his car until his knuckles split. Blood smeared across the metal, a mirror of the blood he couldn't wash from his memory. But resistance, instead of breaking him, hardened him. If the police were watching, he'd move more carefully. If his friends abandoned him, he'd walk alone. If his family begged him to stop, he'd carry their grief alongside his own. Each blockade the system built only deepened his resolve. He began changing his routines: burner phones, cash-only purchases, late-night movements. He grew sharper, colder, his grief now a blade honed by constant betrayal. Yet with every step forward, the toll grew heavier. He caught his reflection one night in the bathroom mirror, hollow eyes, clenched jaw, muscles taut with rage. He barely recognized himself. The boy who had once argued with Sophia over mango ice pops was gone. In his place stood something harder, something unyielding. He whispered to the mirror, his voice low and haunted. "What are you becoming?" The answer never came. The momentum built anyway. One night, he slipped into a rally disguised among the crowd who'd pulled low. He watched Matthew Carver speak on stage, his words dripping with venom, dressed as patriotism. "We are protectors," Matthew thundered. "We are men of honor. They call us hateful because they fear us. But we will not bow. We will not break," the crowd roared, fists raised. And then David saw it. The police lining the exits, nodding along, some even clapping. It wasn't just tolerance. It was allegiance. His stomach twisted, but his mind sharpened. This wasn't just about Sophia anymore. This was bigger, an entire city infected, a system that needed to be broken open. But cracks appeared in his armor. One evening, a friend from childhood, Miguel, showed up at his door. He hadn't seen him since the funeral. "David, listen to me," Miguel said, urgency in his voice. "They're building a case against you. They've got eyes everywhere. If you keep pushing, they'll bury you before you touch any of them." David's hands clenched. "Then let them. What's left for me without justice?" Miguel grabbed his arm, desperate. "Sophia wouldn't want this." David ripped free, his voice rising, raw. "Don't you dare tell me what Sophia would want. You weren't there. You didn't hold her while she died." The silence that followed was suffocating. Miguel's face fell, pain and guilt in his eyes. Finally, he whispered, "You're not the brother I knew." And then he left, the door closing like a coffin lid. Alone again, David returned to his notebook. He traced the names, the addresses, the routines. Each word was a chain binding him tighter to the path he couldn't leave. The resistance of the system, the abandonment of friends, the pleas of his family, they weren't deterrents anymore. They were fuel, proof that justice would never come unless he forged it himself. And with every obstacle, every betrayal, the fire inside him roared louder. He would not stop. He could not stop. Because in the silence of his room, when the world was asleep, he still heard Sophia's last breath. And that sound demanded only one thing: retribution. David's descent into the fire of vengeance left him with only one destination: confrontation. Every page of his notebook, every sleepless night, every betrayal had been leading here. The opportunity came in whispers. A rally bigger than any before. Lucas, Matthew, and Trevor all scheduled to appear, standing together on the same stage, declaring their warped vision of patriotism to a city already cracked by fear. The police promised heightened security. David knew what that meant: protection for them, surveillance for him. But it didn't matter anymore. He would walk into their world, into their sanctuary, and tear it apart from the inside. The night of the rally was humid, thick with the taste of rain. David dressed in dark clothes, gloves tucked tight, a hood pulled low. The hammer rested in his backpack, but it wasn't the only weapon now. He carried a knife, duct tape, and a small pistol he'd bought on the street, its weight both foreign and terrifying in his hand. That as he approached the venue, a warehouse on the edge of town, chance rolled into the air, sharp and venomous. Floodlights cut through the dark, illuminating rows of men with armbands, their shadows stretching long across the asphalt. The police stood in formation again, but this time David saw it clearly. They weren't guarding the city from hate. They were guarding hate itself. David slipped into the crowd, blending with the restless energy. The chants throbbed in his ears. His heart pounded in sync, every beat a drum of rage. And then they appeared. Lucas Brandt, broad and smirking, swaggered onto the stage. Matthew Carver followed, his polished words already spilling into the microphone, a speech crafted to sound noble while dripping with venom. Trevor Collins brought up the rear, his raw anger electrifying the crowd like fire. The sight of them together ignited something in David that no hesitation could douse. His vision tunneled. He no longer saw the crowd, the police, or even the city. He saw only them, the men who had stolen his sister's life and mocked his grief. He moved forward, slipping past clusters of men, every step heavy with purpose. He reached the edge of the stage as Matthew's words rang out. They call us monsters, but we are protectors, defenders, and we will not be silenced. The crowd roared, fists raised. David's hand closed around the hammer. He vaulted onto the stage. For a moment, the world froze. The chants faltered. The lights bore down on him, blinding, hot. Lucas's smirk widened, almost amused. Trevor snarled, fists tightening. Matthew's eyes narrowed, calculating. And then David swung. The hammer cracked across Trevor's jaw, the sound sharp and sickening. The younger man collapsed, screaming, blood spraying across the stage. Chaos erupted, shouts, scrambling feet, the crowd surging forward. Lucas lunged, tackling David, fists pounding against his ribs. David swung blindly, the hammer catching Lucas across the temple. The man roared in pain, stumbling back. Matthew grabbed the microphone stand, swinging it like a spear. David ducked, the metal glancing off his shoulder. Pain flared, but rage drowned it. He drove forward, slamming Matthew to the ground, his knife flashing. The blade pressed against Matthew's throat, the man's polished mask cracking into terror. "You killed her," David hissed, his voice shaking with fury. "You laughed while she died." Matthew choked on his words, his arrogance gone. I wasn't liar." David pressed harder, the knife breaking skin, a thin line of red staining Matthew's collar. The crowd screamed, the police surged forward, and yet David heard none of it. He was somewhere else, back on the street, holding Sophia as her blood pooled around him. His grip tightened. One push, one thrust. It would all end here. But then, in the blur of rage, he saw Matthew's eyes, not defiant, not hateful, but afraid. Human, just like Lucas, just like Trevor, just like every man who hid behind banners and chants, because without them, they were small. And in that flash of clarity, David saw himself kneeling on a stage, knife pressed to a man's throat, his sister's blood in his memory. Another man's about to be on his hands. His reflection in Matthew's fear was undeniable. He had become the very monster he despised. His chest heaved, torn between two truths. Sophia deserved justice. But was this justice or vengeance dressed in its skin? The microphone lay near his hand, still live, its cord trailing across the floor. He could kill Matthew, silence the lies and blood, or he could speak, expose the truth, not with violence, but with words that couldn't be erased. His hand trembled. Behind him, Lucas staggered upright, blood trickling down his temple, hatred burning in his eyes. Trevor groaned on the floor, teeth shattered, blood dripping from his mouth. The crowd howled. The police pushed closer, the moment teetering on the edge of explosion. David had seconds to choose. He raised the knife high. Gasps rippled through the crowd. His arm trembled, his muscles burning with the weight of rage and grief. David grabbed the microphone instead. His voice rang out, raw and broken, echoing through the warehouse. "They killed my sister, 16 years old, unarmed, innocent, and they laughed while she bled. And the police," he turned, eyes burning at the officers frozen in place. They stood there. They watched. They let it happen. The crowd erupted, some in rage, some in shock, some in denial. But the words hung heavy in the air, undeniable, impossible to erase. "This is your system," David shouted, "a system that protects killers and buries the dead in silence. My sister is gone, but her blood will stain every single one of you until the truth breaks through." The microphone screeched as officers swarmed the stage, tackling him to the ground. Pain exploded as fists and boots rained down. He was dragged off, his body battered, his voice silenced, but not before his words had carved through the chaos. Later, in the sterile quiet of a holding cell, blood dripping from his mouth, David sat alone. The rally had ended in chaos. The hate group leaders were injured but alive. Matthew's carefully crafted mask was shattered in public. Lucas's arrogance was fractured. Trevor's rage had been exposed as weakness. And David, bloody, broken but unbowed, had spoken truth into a microphone broadcast across the city. But the cost was immense. His body ached. His family was broken further, and the line between justice and vengeance was blurred beyond recognition. He had wanted to avenge Sophia, to punish her killers, but in doing so, he had nearly become one himself. He stared at his hands, bruised and swollen, and whispered into the silence, "Sophia, did I do right, or did I just drown us both?" There was no answer, only the echo of her laughter in his memory, fading into the hollow quiet of his cell. Victory and destruction, indistinguishable. The cell was cold, the concrete pressing against David's back as if trying to swallow him whole. Hours blurred into days, each one marked by silence broken only by the footsteps of guards and the hollow clang of doors. His body healed slowly, but his mind remained fractured, caught between Sophia's laughter and her final scream. Outside those walls, the city burned with the aftermath of his stand. The footage of his confrontation had gone viral, clips of him slamming the knife into the stage, of him shouting his sister's story into the microphone, of the police dragging him off while the crowd roared. For once, the narrative couldn't be controlled. News anchors debated endlessly. Was David Martinez a grieving brother crying for justice or a dangerous vigilante inciting violence? Was he a symbol of courage or proof that rage breeds chaos? Every channel had a different answer, but none of them erased what the city had seen with its own eyes. The hate group leaders exposed, their polished masks cracking under the weight of truth. Lucas Brandt, with his fractured skull and bloodied face, vanished from the public eye. His construction company collapsed, contracts pulled after sponsors fled. The swaggering leader who once claimed to protect heritage was reduced to a ghost, hiding from the same streets he had once marched upon. Matthew Carver's veneer of sophistication crumbled. The footage of him pinned beneath David's knife replayed across the internet, stripped of his rhetoric, leaving only a man pale and trembling, his honor shattered. Donors withdrew. His wife filed for separation. His cultural foundation folded under scrutiny. Trevor Collins became a cautionary tale. His mangled jaw and broken teeth silenced the furious voice that once rallied followers. Videos of him, bleeding and shrieking, became memes, his anger reduced to ridicule. Even his allies distanced themselves, branding him unstable, unfit for leadership. The hate group fractured. Some members scattered, others turned on each other. What had once seemed like an unstoppable tide of venom was now a splintered mess, fighting to stay relevant. On the surface, it seemed David had won, but victories come with costs, and his was immense. His family, already broken by Sophia's death, crumbled under the weight of his choices. His mother stopped visiting after his 3rd week in custody, unable to look at the son who had nearly killed men in cold blood. His father came once, standing silently on the other side of the glass, his eyes filled with sorrow and something heavier disappointment. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His silence was a verdict sharper than any gavel. The community that once rallied for Sophia's memory grew divided. Some lit candles outside the jail, chanting David's name as a symbol of resistance. Others whispered that he had gone too far, that he had dishonored her memory by becoming what he hated. The same neighbors who once offered prayers now debated whether he was a hero or a monster, and David, sitting alone in his cell, wondered the same doubt at night. The guards left him in silence. That was when Sophia came to him, not in body, but in memory. Her laughter, her teasing, her voice calling him her mom. But sometimes, when the silence stretched too long, he heard her differently, accusing, sorrowful. "You promised to protect me." "I tried," he whispered into the dark. His throat tightened. "I tried," but the silence answered back with the image of his hands clutching the knife, trembling above Matthew's throat. He had been inches away from spilling blood, from becoming no different than the men he hated. The question gnawed at him, relentless. Was justice worth this? Months passed. Trials began, not his, not yet, but investigations into the hate group and the officials who had protected them. The footage had forced the system's hand. Corruption couldn't be ignored anymore. Officers were questioned, some suspended. The police chief resigned for health reasons. The district attorney faced inquiries over campaign donations. The machine that had stood so immovable began to creak under pressure, but David was not free to see it. He remained behind bars, awaiting his own trial. Charges piled high: assault with a deadly weapon, inciting a riot, attempted murder. His lawyer, a weary public defender, warned him, best case, you serve years. Worst case, decades. David only nodded. Time no longer mattered to him. He had already lost the only measure of time that counted: Sophia's future. On the day of his hearing, he stood in chains before the judge. Cameras lined the back of the courtroom, reporters scribbling every detail. The hate group leader sat at the other side, bruised but alive, glaring daggers at him. When asked if he wished to speak, David's voice was steady, though his hands trembled. "They killed my sister," he said, eyes locked on the judge, "and the system protected them. I did what I thought was right. Maybe it wasn't, maybe it was wrong, but I will never apologize for fighting for her. Never." The courtroom buzzed, half outrage, half admiration. The judge's gavel silenced them. "This court will decide whether your actions served justice or destroyed it." Back in his cell that night, David sat with his back to the wall, staring at the ceiling. His body was weary, his spirit frayed, but his mind replayed it all: the laughter in the kitchen, the mango ice pops at the park, Sophia's small hand gripping his as the mob surged. He closed his eyes, whispering her name into the dark. Justice had come, in fragments, the hate group dismantled, the system forced to face its rot. But the cost was his family, his freedom, his peace of mind. He had become both weapon and wound, savior and sinner. The city might heal, his family might someday forgive, but he would remain in this cell, chained not just by iron but by memory, haunted by the question that would never let him rest: was it worth it? The world moved on, new marches, new headlines, new battles, but in a quiet corner of the city, a small gravestone bore Sophia's name. Flowers wilted and were replaced, candles burned down and were relit, and in the silence of that place, beneath the weight of Miami's sun, the story lingered: a sister lost, a brother broken, a system cracked but not destroyed. Justice had come, yes, but it had come wrapped in tragedy, steeped in blood, leaving behind not triumph but a hollow echo, and in that echo lived the truth revenge consumes. Justice demands sacrifice, and some wounds never heal.